I never asked for this. I never wanted them. But no one else was around, so I had no choice. That's what Jennifer Moore wrote in the letter she left on the kitchen counter, just hours after she ended the lives of all 8 of her stepchildren. She was 38, an exhausted woman in a house full of too many demands and too little help. For years, she had cared for her husband's children, taking on a mother's role when their biological mother disappeared from their lives, chasing her own desires for freedom and escape. Neighbors saw Jennifer slowly unravel, her smile fading, her eyes losing their light. She never complained. She just carried on, quietly suffocating under the weight. No one stepped in. No one saw. And when her husband left for a weekend business trip, Jennifer didn't argue when he dropped all 8 children off. 2 days later, the house was still. Too still. No laughter, no chaos, no running feet, just silence, and Jennifer sitting still, on the couch, waiting for the police to come. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a moment of rage. It was the slow collapse of a woman who had been buried alive under the weight of motherhood that wasn't hers, in a world that never cared. This is the story of the stepmother who snapped, and the children who paid the ultimate price. Jennifer Moore had always been the kind of woman who kept to herself. At 38, she was still relatively young, but already felt much older, weighed down by years of managing a household that seemed to grow louder, messier, and more chaotic with each passing day. Before marrying Richard, Jennifer had been independent-focused, on her career, her friends, and her own space. Life had been quieter then. She'd lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, kept everything neat, and never had to answer to anyone. But after she said, "I do," everything changed. Richard, a well-meaning but often absent man, came with a baggage heavier than she had anticipated. His 8 children, ranging in age from a toddler to teenagers, became Jennifer's full-time responsibility almost overnight. Their biological mother, Samantha, had disappeared years ago, chasing her own interests far away from her children. She would send a postcard or a text now and then, but she was mostly a stranger to them. And to Jennifer, the role of stepmother became one she never fully embraced, but one she took on out of necessity. Richard worked long hours as a corporate manager, often traveling for business. The children were left in Jennifer's care for days at a time, with no real respite. It wasn't that she disliked them, but there was always a deep sense of weariness in her heart that she couldn't shake. She never voiced it, of course. No, Jennifer was too proud to complain. She had committed to this life, after all, and she wasn't about to go back on that. The house they lived in was a large, creaky 2-story home, a bit outdated and in need of repair. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floors creaked underfoot, as if the house itself was groaning under the weight of so many people. There was a constant hum of noise, a child crying, another yelling at a sibling, the clatter of dishes and toys. Jennifer had learned to move through it, like a silent observer, trying to find moments of peace in the small spaces between the chaos. The kitchen, once a place where she used to enjoy experimenting with new recipes and preparing quiet meals, had become a battleground. At least once a day, she'd find herself standing in front of the refrigerator, staring blankly at the contents inside, unsure of what to make. The fridge was often stocked with leftovers from days before, half empty. Containers of macaroni and cheese, wilted salad, boxes of cereal. She never had the energy to cook like she once did. In the mornings, her routine was like clockwork. She had no choice but to keep things running smoothly. She would rise at 5:30 a.m., long before the kids stirred, to prepare breakfast and ensure they were dressed and ready for school. By 6 a.m., she'd start waking the older ones. The younger ones were more of a challenge, and their constant needs felt like a pressure that never let up. Her life, once her own, had been replaced by a rhythm of never-ending tasks. Every corner of the house seemed to demand her attention, and it was a pressure she silently carried. "Jennifer, the eggs are cold." Jessica, the 10-year-old, would yell from the kitchen, her voice sharp and demanding. Jennifer didn't respond. She just stirred the eggs a little longer, letting them cook at a lower temperature. She didn't want to yell. Yelling felt like something that would break her. So she stayed quiet, turning the eggs over and over until they were soft and scrambled, just the way the kids liked them. It was a small victory, but Jennifer didn't feel victorious. She felt numb. The kids, all of them, had their quirks. The twins, Timmy and Tommy, were nearly impossible to get ready on time. One would fight over his shoes, the other over what color of shirt to wear. Emily, the teenager, was the hardest to manage. She came in late from parties, rolled her eyes at Jennifer's requests, and barely acknowledged her presence. The younger kids were more manageable, though they required constant attention. And of course, the toddler Ben was the loudest. His cries and whines echoed through the house from morning until night. Jennifer had never been one to lose her temper, but there were days when she could feel it bubbling up. She'd snap at them for the smallest things, even though she knew they were only kids. "How many times do I have to tell you to eat your cereal?" She'd snap at Timmy when he had yet another excuse to avoid breakfast. She didn't yell, but her words felt harsh, and that made her feel worse. She tried her best to be kind, but there were times when it was all too much. She never asked for help. She wouldn't dare. Richard's job was important, and she had to play her part. Besides, asking for help meant admitting how overwhelmed she was, and that was something Jennifer just couldn't do. But over time, it was clear to anyone who paid attention that she wasn't okay. Her posture had started to change. She was slumping more often now, even when she stood. Her skin, once radiant, had taken on a dull tone, and her eyes, once full of warmth, now appeared perpetually tired. She would stand in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her hair, staring at her reflection as if it wasn't really her. Her face had lost its light, and she couldn't remember the last time she smiled genuinely. It wasn't just the children. It wasn't just the house or the laundry or the endless tasks. It was the constant feeling that no one saw her. Richard came home every evening, often too tired to ask about her day, and when he did ask, it was always about the kids. Always about what needed fixing in the house. The house itself had become an extension of the chaos inside her mind, unfinished. Projects, broken pieces, and things she couldn't bring herself to repair. Jennifer didn't think about her own needs anymore. They didn't matter. It was the kids. Always the kids. It wasn't as if she didn't love them. She did, in her own way. But the love, once vibrant and warm, had become stretched thin. Jennifer started to feel like she was walking on a tightrope, trying to balance everything in her life, but the rope was fraying. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the act. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jennifer sat down at the kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in front of her. The silence that followed their bedtime was almost more oppressive than the noise had been. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She hadn't gotten a moment to herself all day. Her hand reached for the stack of papers she'd been meaning to look at, bills, forms, a few notes Richard had left for her. But instead, her fingers found the old photograph of her, Richard, and the kids from their first family outing. She hadn't remembered putting it there, but it was an image that had always made her smile. But tonight, it didn't. Tonight, Jennifer felt an unfamiliar wave of resentment wash over her. She couldn't explain why, but the picture seemed to mock her, to remind her of a life she had no part in creating, a life that had consumed everything she had left. She stared at it for a long time, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The image of Richard smiling, so full of hope, seemed distant. The children, too frozen in time, innocent and unaware of the pressure mounting on her shoulders. But Jennifer knew the truth now. This wasn't the life she had signed up for. This wasn't the life she had imagined when she said yes to Richard. Her gaze dropped from the picture to the cluttered counter. There were dirty dishes, half-finished. Homework, remnants of meals she had no energy to clean up. She blinked back the tears, though they were slow to come. Jennifer Moore was tired, and she was starting to wonder just how much longer she could keep pretending. The days in the Moore household were a blur, each one merging into the next. The mornings were the same, the shrill sound of the alarm clock, cutting through the silence, followed by the groan of Jennifer rolling out of bed. She would stretch, a dull ache settling into her back, and then slowly shuffle toward the kitchen, where the sounds of the children waking up would begin to fill the house. There was no such thing as quiet in this house anymore. Her feet would drag against the floor as she made her way through the cluttered hallway. The floor, once a clean surface, was now littered with scattered shoes, backpacks, and discarded toys. Every surface in the house had become a catch-all for everything. The kitchen counter, once pristine and organized, was now a maze of half-empty cereal boxes, dirty dishes, and school papers. The living room was no better. Cushions lay on the floor, clothes were tossed haphazardly, and toys were scattered across the space like forgotten relics of childhood. The house, with its creaky floors and outdated furniture, seemed to sigh under the weight of so many people, so much mess. It was no longer a home. It was a prison. Jennifer used to love her home, but now she only saw it as a constant reminder of everything she had lost and everything she was still expected to give. Children's voices echoed through the hallways from the moment they woke up until the last one finally fell asleep. Ben, the toddler, would start crying as soon as his eyes opened, his wails cutting through the stillness. Jennifer's heart would clench at the sound, knowing that this was just the beginning of another exhausting day. Then came the older ones, each with their own set of demands and frustrations. Jessica would need help finding her school uniform. Timmy would have a tantrum over breakfast, pushing his cereal away because he didn't want to eat it. Emily, the teenager, would saunter in, barely acknowledging Jennifer as she reached for her phone, already lost in her own world. And the mess? Oh, the mess. Jennifer had long since given up trying to keep things clean. The floors were sticky in places, and the air always smelled faintly of leftover food, spilled milk, and wet diapers. The laundry basket never seemed to empty. Every corner of the house, every room, felt like it was drowning in clutter. The bathroom had become a battlefield of shampoo bottles, toothpaste tubes, and towels that never made it back to the linen. Closet, a kitchen sink, forever overflowing with dishes, seemed to mock her efforts to keep things together. Jennifer used to pride herself on keeping a tidy home, on making sure everything was in its place. But now, there was no place for anything. The children were everywhere, their noise, their demands, their mess. There was no personal space for Jennifer, no room to breathe. She found herself hiding in the small corners of the house, moments of solitude that quickly evaporated the second a child needed something. And it wasn't just the mess. It was the constant need for attention. Jennifer had become a walking, talking solution to every problem. She was the one to fix the broken toys, to settle the arguments, to soothe the crying. But no one saw her. No one asked how she was doing, how she was feeling. Richard, well-meaning but oblivious, never noticed the weight she carried. He would come home from work, tired and ready for a break, but unaware that his wife was already breaking under the pressure of raising his children. "I'll take care of dinner," he'd say, the words meant to be helpful, but coming across as a hollow gesture. Jennifer would nod, too tired to argue, too exhausted to care. He would sit down on the couch, his long day at work evident on his face, while Jennifer continued to manage the chaos around her. She never complained. She didn't want to seem ungrateful, didn't want to make things harder for him. But every day, she felt more and more like a servant in her own home. Jennifer didn't know when it started, when the constant demands and responsibilities had turned from manageable to crushing. Maybe it had always been this way, but it hadn't felt so suffocating until recently. She had grown accustomed to the noise, to the chaos, but now it felt like it was closing in on her. There were no breaks, no respite. And even when Richard offered help, it wasn't the kind of help she needed. He didn't understand that she wasn't just physically tired. She was mentally drained. Sometimes, when she was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes, she would close her eyes for a moment, just to escape. She longed for the silence she once had, the peace of being alone, of not having to manage everyone's needs. But there was no time for that. She would feel a sharp pang in her chest at the thought of being alone. It had been so long since she had known what it was like to truly be by herself, without the constant pull of responsibility. Jennifer had started to resent the children, though she would never admit it, even to herself. It wasn't that she didn't care about them. She did, but their needs were so constant, so relentless, that she couldn't help but feel suffocated by them. She began to snap at them more often, her patience wearing thin. "Stop fighting." She would yell, even though she knew they were just being kids. But her tolerance had grown razor thin. Every minor infraction, every little thing that went wrong, felt like it was one more thing that was too much for her to handle. She didn't know how to stop. She didn't know how to ask for help. Her husband didn't understand. The neighbors, though well-meaning, would occasionally ask how she was doing, but they never really asked. They just wanted to know that everything was fine. It was always, "You're doing such a great job, Jennifer," with a smile that made Jennifer feel more invisible than ever. And yet, despite all of this, she kept going. She kept feeding the children, kept putting them to bed, kept cleaning up after them. There was no choice. The days passed in a blur of noise and exhaustion, and Jennifer found herself moving through them like a zombie, her body on autopilot. Her mind too tired to function. It was during one of those rare moments of quiet, after the kids had gone to bed, that Jennifer found herself sitting on the couch in the living room, staring at the television. The flickering screen was the only sound in the house. Richard had fallen asleep in his armchair, and the house felt, for the first time in a long while, still. But the stillness was suffocating. Jennifer stared at the empty room, the pile of laundry in the corner, the dishes in the sink, the unmade bed in the next room. She couldn't breathe. The silence, instead of bringing relief, felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. This was her life now. This was the rest of her life. She had given up her independence for a family that didn't see her, for a husband who was blind to her struggle. The thought of escaping crossed her mind for a fleeting moment, but she quickly pushed it away. There was no escape. She had nowhere to go. This was it. She wondered, briefly, if this was how it would always be. Would she wake up every day, caught in this unending cycle of noise and exhaustion, her soul slowly draining away? Would she ever get a moment to herself? Or was she doomed to lose herself completely in the role of caretaker, the woman who never stopped, never complained, never asked for help? The quiet felt louder now than ever before. And in that silence, Jennifer found herself wishing, just for a moment, for peace. But peace was a luxury she had no right to ask for. It was another morning, like so many others in the Moore house. But something about today felt different. Jennifer's eyes fluttered open at 5:30 a.m., the familiar groan of the alarm clock echoing through the house. But today, there was no rush to get up, no urgency to start the routine that had become so predictable, so suffocating. For the first time in a long time, Jennifer felt a heavy sense of dread settle deep in her chest. The house was already awake, but today it felt like it was closing in on her. Ben, the toddler, was already crying. The sound sliced through the air, sharp and insistent. Jennifer pushed herself out of bed slowly, the weight of her body making every movement feel like a chore. Her back ached more than usual, the arthritis creeping up her spine with each passing day. She rubbed her temples, trying to push the exhaustion away, but it lingered, thick like fog. She stepped into the hallway, the floor beneath her feet sticky. From spilled juice, she hadn't had the energy to clean up last night. The house smelled faintly of old food, wet towels, and the sharp tongue of detergent. Her heart sank. It wasn't just the noise. It wasn't just the mess. It was everything. Ben's cries continued, echoing through the walls, and Jennifer felt a sudden surge of frustration. She moved toward the room, her hands trembling, but not from the cold. It wasn't the physical strain that got to her anymore. No, it was the mental weight, the endless demands, the noise, the chaos. "Ben, please stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as she reached for him in the crib. He pulled away, his tiny face scrunched up in distress, his body stiff as though he could sense her growing impatience. Jennifer gently picked him up, but her hands shook as she did so. Her mind drifted, the weight of her thoughts heavier than the child in her arms. What was she doing? How had she gotten here? She thought back to her life before Richard, before the kids, before everything became a blur of noise, mess, and constant demands. Jennifer used to dream of simpler things, quiet moments, a life where she could come and go as she pleased. She remembered weekends spent in peaceful solitude, curled up with a book or gardening in the backyard of her small apartment. She could almost smell the fresh air, the peace. But now, it was all gone, replaced by tantrums noise, and the feeling of being trapped in a house that no longer felt like her own. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps thumping down the stairs. Emily, the teenager, appeared at the doorway of the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. She wasn't wearing the uniform Jennifer had laid out for her the night before. Her hair was a tangled mess, and there was a bored look in her eyes. "Mom, where's my phone?" Emily asked, her voice flat and uninterested. Jennifer bit back the retort that wanted to spill out. She didn't have the energy for it. "I don't know, sweetie." "Look in your room." "I already did," Emily sighed, rolling her eyes. "I'm going to be late if I can't find it." Jennifer sighed, holding Ben tighter in her arms, trying to calm him down. She could feel the frustration building again. She couldn't keep up with everything. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how many hours she spent running after the kids, there was always more to do. Always more to give. And she had nothing left. "Can you just help me?" Emily demanded, her voice becoming sharper. Jennifer's hands trembled again, this time from a different kind of tension. She bit her lip to keep herself from snapping. But it was getting harder to hold it all in. "I'm busy with Ben," Jennifer said, her voice tight, trying to mask the exhaustion she felt. "Look somewhere else." Emily let out a dramatic sigh and turned away, stomping upstairs without another word. The silence in the kitchen was deafening now, and Jennifer felt it. The quiet between the chaos was the worst part of it all. She walked over to the counter, trying to gather her thoughts, but her mind was racing. The kitchen was a disaster. The dishes from last night still sat in the sink. The trash was overflowing. School papers were scattered across the table, some torn, others crumpled into tight balls. There was no space for anything. No room for her to breathe. And then the bickering started. Timmy and Tommy, the twins, came running into the kitchen, arguing over who had the bigger bowl of cereal. The noise was unbearable. The sound of their voices clashing, the constant whine of Ben in her arms, it was too much. Jennifer's hands clenched, her heart pounding. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it all out, but it only grew louder. "Stop it!" She finally snapped, the words bursting from her before she could stop them. She didn't yell often, but when she did, it felt like the entire house trembled. "Just stop!" The twins froze, their eyes wide. Timmy looked like he was about to cry, while Tommy just stared at her, his mouth open in disbelief. Ben's cries grew louder, and Jennifer felt the pressure in her chest rise, her breath quickening. She hadn't meant to yell. She hadn't meant to lose it. But the stress, the exhaustion, the constant noise, it had all built up over time, and now is spilling over. The emotional weight of trying to be everything to everyone had become unbearable. She glanced over at the clock. It was only 8 a.m. The day had barely begun, and she already felt like she was drowning. She wanted to scream, to escape, but she couldn't. There was nowhere to go. The house was her prison, the children her wardens. Jennifer moved to the sink, holding Ben tightly against her chest, and began rinsing the dishes. Her hands shook as she scrubbed the plates, the water hot against her skin. But it wasn't enough to calm the storm inside her. Her mind kept drifting, the thoughts darker now, more insistent. What if I just walked out? What if I just left it all behind? She tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her. The idea of peace, of quiet, was so tempting. She couldn't keep up anymore. The kids, the house, the demands, it was all too much. And Richard? He was always gone. He was always too busy, too tired to notice what was happening. She had become the mother, the housekeeper, the caretaker, the mediator, all without ever asking for any of it. And now she was losing herself. Jennifer stopped washing the dishes. The water ran over the plates, the sound like a distant echo. She closed her eyes, her grip tightening on the edge of the sink. What if I just stopped? What if the noise ended? The thought hung in the air like a heavy fog. She didn't speak it aloud. She didn't even know if she believed it. But it was there, in the silence between the noise. Her hands shook more now, not just from the physical exhaustion, but from the realization that she had reached a point of no return. There was no way out. The responsibility would never stop. The children, the house, the endless demands, they would always be there. And for the first time, Jennifer felt something inside her snap. The weight of it all, the crushing responsibility, the constant noise, the constant need for her, it had become too much. She wanted to escape. She wanted peace. But there was no way out. Her hands shook harder as she placed the dishes down on the counter, her breath quickening. The decision was already starting to form in her mind. What if I just made it stop? She could hear the kids fighting behind her again, their bickering filling the empty spaces in her mind. But this time, it didn't make her flinch. It didn't make her want to scream. It just made her feel numb. The thought settled deeper inside her, and for the first time in years, Jennifer felt like she was finally getting control over something. Not the children, not the house, but her own mind. She didn't know what she would do. She didn't know how to fix it. But she was done. The idea had taken root. Jennifer had never imagined it would come to this. For years, she had carried the weight of a life that wasn't hers to bear, quietly and without complaint. The constant noise, the endless demands, feeling of being trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. It had all built up over time, like a pressure cooker slowly reaching its boiling point. But now, as she stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, she knew. The decision had been made. That it wasn't a moment of rage. There were no loud outbursts, no chaotic arguments. It wasn't even a sudden thought that flared up in the heat of the moment. It was methodical, calm, a quiet, steady realization that something had to give. Richard had left for a weekend business trip, his briefcase clutched in his hand as he kissed her goodbye with the usual empty promises. He'd be back on Sunday evening, he said. She would be fine. He always said that, but he never noticed the strain on her face. He never saw the exhaustion in her eyes. The kids were already settled into their rooms, and the house, for the first time in weeks, was quiet. The kind of quiet that felt heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She watched them all fall asleep, the rhythmic rise and fall of their chests as they lay in their beds. Oblivious to the storm brewing in her mind, that Jennifer had spent the entire day cleaning, trying to keep herself occupied. The laundry had piled up, and there were dishes in the sink from last night's rush dinner. She didn't even remember eating. Her body moved through the motions, folding clothes, sweeping the floors, putting the toys away, but her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't just the mess or the noise anymore. It wasn't even the kids. It was everything. As she stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkening sky, she realized how far she had fallen. She used to dream of quiet nights, of coming home to a peaceful house. She had imagined that motherhood would be a choice, something that filled her with joy and fulfillment, not something that drained every ounce of energy from her body. But now, as she felt the cool breeze drift through the open window, she understood this was no longer her life. She had been holding on for so long, pretending she was fine, but she wasn't. She wasn't fine at all. The decision had been coming for a while now, and today it felt inevitable. She had planned it out in her mind a dozen times, each scenario, more elaborate than the last. The thought had been with her for days, perhaps weeks, but it had been a whisper at first. Now it was a loud, undeniable voice, one that drowned out all other thoughts. The children had been put to bed, their bickering silenced for the night, and she had a moment of stillness, of peace. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cabinet, pulling out a small bottle of medication. She had been careful. She knew exactly what she needed, exactly how much to use. It wasn't an impulsive act, not at all. It was a decision that had been made long before tonight. In the quiet moments, when the house was still, Jennifer had thought about this. She had planned every detail, every movement, every word she would say when the time came. She walked through the house, her footsteps soft on the warm carpet, her mind quieting as she focused on the task at hand. The children were all asleep, and it was as if the house had exhaled, finally settling into the silence it had always craved. There was no more noise, no more demands. There was just her, standing alone in the hallway, her body aching from years of constant movement. She felt hollow inside, like an empty shell, She had nothing left to give. Nothing at all, Dot. Jennifer stood at the doorway of the first bedroom, looking in at the children. Their faces were peaceful in sleep, their limbs sprawled across the beds in the way children do when they are exhausted from a long day of playing. She watched them for a moment, her heart heavy, but there was no doubt in her mind. This was the only way. She moved quietly from one room to the next, checking on each child, making sure they were all asleep. Timmy and Tommy were in one room, their little bodies tangled in the sheets. Emily, the teenager, was in another room, her face turned toward the wall as she clutched her phone in her hand. Ben, the toddler, was tucked into his crib, his thumb in his mouth, his face soft with innocence. Jennifer paused at each bed, her breath steady, her hands calm, though her mind screamed with 1,000 thoughts. But in the stillness of the house, the decision seemed right. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel rage. She only felt relief. It was the kind of relief that comes with an inevitable decision, one that has been slowly brewing beneath the surface for so long that when it finally arrives, it feels like a weight lifting off her shoulders. Jennifer reached for the small bottle of medication again, the one she had set aside earlier, and walked back into the kitchen. The children were all settled, each one peacefully asleep, unaware of the fate that was about to unfold. She felt no guilt, no remorse. She had been pushed too far, for too long, and now there was only silence, only stillness. With calm precision, Jennifer began her task. She poured the medication into a glass of water, swirling it until it dissolved completely. The glass was cool in her hands, but the weight of her actions felt lighter than it had ever been. She wasn't acting out of malice, but out of a deep, aching need for peace. The world had been too loud for too long. The demands, the noise, the constant need for her to give. She couldn't do it anymore. She walked back through the house, the glass of water in her hands. She stood at the doorway of each child's room, watching them sleep peacefully, unaware. Her heart clenched with something she couldn't define, but it wasn't regret. It wasn't fear. It was just exhaustion, the need to make it stop. First child she approached was Timmy. He was sleeping soundly, his face relaxed, his small body curled into the blankets. She sat beside him, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for his mouth. Gently, she tipped the glass to his lips. He stirred, but didn't wake. It was over in an instant. Jennifer moved to the next child, and the next. Each room was silent, as she carried out the task, one by one. No loud cries, no sudden movements, just the stillness of her actions, as calm and methodical as the decision itself. She moved as if in a trance, the weight of what she was doing already absorbed in her mind. It had to be done. When she reached Ben's room, she paused for a moment. His little face, so peaceful in sleep, almost made her stop. Almost. But she didn't. She gently placed the glass to his lips, watching his eyelids flutter as he drank. The act was done. Finally, Jennifer stood in the doorway of the last room, where Emily lay. The teenager was curled on her side, her phone discarded on the bed beside her. Jennifer watched her for a moment, the familiar feeling of resentment stirring. Again, but she pushed it aside. Emily, like the others, would be gone too. When it was done, Jennifer stood in the middle of the house, her breathing slow and steady. There was no noise now. No bickering, no crying, no demands. Just the heavy silence that had settled over the house. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel regret. She only felt relief. It was the kind of peace she had longed for. But it felt hollow, empty. Jennifer walked to the living room, sat down in her favorite chair, and waited. There would be no shouting. There would be no tears. She had made the decision, and now there was only stillness. It was the only peace she would ever know again. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that fills a room with a weight, like the air has thickened with something that can never be undone. Jennifer sat in the living room, her body still, her hands folded in her lap. The soft glow of the lamp beside her cast a dim yellow light over the room, its faint hum almost louder than the silence itself. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had changed, the neighbors moving about their usual business, unaware of the horror that had unfolded just across the street. Inside, Jennifer remained unmoving. She wasn't numb, though it might have looked that way. She was calm, almost eerily so, as if every decision she'd made had already been absorbed into her mind, as if the act itself had been planned long before that night. The events of the evening had already settled in her consciousness, and the aftermath didn't bring panic or even a sense of guilt. No, what Jennifer felt was relief, heavy, suffocating relief. The noise had stopped. The burden of it all had finally ended. She didn't flinch when the first knock on the door came. It was soft, tentative, but Jennifer had been expecting it. She didn't rise from her chair or make a sound. Her eyes remained fixed on the wall in front of her, her fingers still folded together in her lap. The knock came again, louder this time, a sense of urgency creeping into the sound. Jennifer didn't move. The silence stretched on, almost unbearable. In its stillness, until the door creaked open, and 2 police officers stepped into the room. The moment they saw her, their eyes shifted. It wasn't fear or shock that they saw in her face. It was calmness, unwavering calmness, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her, and she was no longer burdened by anything but the silence. "Ma'am, are you Jennifer Moore?" "One of the officers asked, his voice soft but firm. Jennifer nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the floor. "We need you to come with us," the officer continued. "There's been a report, and we need to ask you a few questions." Jennifer didn't speak. She stood slowly, deliberately, and followed the officers without a word. They guided her toward the back of the house, to the stairs where the children's rooms lay. She felt nothing as she walked past them, past the crumpled sheets on the floor and the discarded toys, past the rooms where once there had been life, now cold and still. The house no longer felt like hers. It felt like a shell, an empty echo of what had once been Dot as she moved. The officers followed her, making quick notes on their notepads. Their eyes swept across the house, taking in the scene. The clean, almost clinical neatness of it all. No signs of struggle. No signs of panic. It was as if everything had been arranged just so carefully, methodically. The children were all in their beds, tucked in tightly as though they had gone to sleep after a long day of normal activities, unaware that the world had shifted forever. Jennifer was seated at the kitchen table when they finally asked her to sit down. One of the officers moved to the counter where Jennifer had placed the glass of water earlier. They didn't say anything about it. They didn't ask. They just noted it silently, along with everything else. The silence of the house. The stillness. In Jennifer's eyes, the way she hadn't reacted at all. "Jennifer, we need you to tell us what happened here," the officer said, his voice more direct now. "We found your children." Jennifer's gaze flickered briefly at the officer, and then she nodded. "I know," she said softly, her voice flat. "I did it." There was no hesitation in her voice, no rush to explain. She simply stated the fact as though it had always been an inevitability. The officer blinked, taken aback by her calmness, but he didn't press further. He began asking her questions about the events leading up to that moment, the day itself, what had happened in the house. He wanted to understand the why behind the act, but Jennifer didn't offer much. She wasn't interested in explaining. I just couldn't do it anymore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't take the noise, the constant need, the constant everything. It was too much." The officers exchanged looks, but Jennifer didn't notice. She was lost in her own thoughts, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the kitchen, her mind replaying the events of the evening, the silence after it was all done, the way the weight of it had lifted from her shoulders. And for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. As the night wore on, the police gathered information. Neighbors were questioned, friends, family. All of them spoke of the same thing: Jennifer's quiet demeanor, her hard-working nature, and her ability to take care of everything. They spoke of her dedication to the children, the sacrifices she had made, but there were whispers too. Whispers about the exhaustion that had been evident for months, the fatigue in her eyes, the way she seemed to age before their eyes. Some remembered seeing her at the store, buying groceries with a blank expression. Others recalled moments when they had offered to help, but Jennifer had always politely declined. "I've got it," she would say. "I'm fine." But they weren't blind. They saw the cracks, even if they didn't understand what they meant. The way her shoulders sagged when she carried the youngest child, the way she seemed to retreat into herself more and more. But no one had stepped in. No one had asked the hard questions. And now, in the aftermath of the tragedy, some felt guilty. Some felt that they should have done more, seen more. But it was too late. The house was silent, and the children were gone. The media coverage began to shift as the story unfolded. The initial shock of the crime had passed, and now the narrative was changing. Jennifer, once painted as a loving stepmother who had done her best, was now being portrayed in a different light. The press was torn between sympathy and horror. Some saw her as a victim of unrelenting pressure, while others painted her as a cold-blooded murderer. The questions grew louder. Was she a victim of circumstance? Or was she simply a monster who had snapped? The public's reaction was just as divided. Some sympathized with Jennifer's plight, citing her exhaustion, her isolation, and the toll that raising 8 children had taken on her. They understood that sometimes people reached their breaking point. It pointed to the lack of support, the absence of Richard, the way her needs had always been secondary. But there were others, many others, who couldn't reconcile the peacefulness of Jennifer's actions with the horror of what she had done. They called her a murderer, plain and simple. They didn't care about her exhaustion or her isolation. They saw only the dead children, and in their eyes, Jennifer was a villain who had no excuse. As the investigation progressed, the authorities found more than just the details of the crime itself. They uncovered the calls Jennifer had made to social services, the requests for help that had gone unanswered. They found the times she had reached out, the times she had begged for respite, for some kind of relief. And yet, each time, the case had been closed. There had been no follow-up, no deeper investigation. Just empty promises and forms that were filed away, forgotten. One of the officers, speaking to the press, made it clear. "She asked for help," he said, "but no one listened. And now we're left picking up the pieces." By the time Jennifer was led away from her home, her face still as expressionless as it had been throughout the investigation. The world had already formed its opinions. The media had already painted her as either a victim or a monster, and the public had followed suit. She would go on trial for the deaths of her 8 stepchildren, but the debate about who was to blame, Jennifer, the system, or the absence of a husband who had never been fully present, would continue long after the case was closed. The story of Jennifer Moore became a symbol of something far larger than one woman's breakdown. It became a commentary on the pressures of motherhood, the exhaustion of caregiving, and the systemic failures that allowed such tragedies to unfold. As the police took her away, Jennifer Moore never looked back. There was nothing left for her in that house. No apologies. No regrets. Just silence. And in that silence, the world would never truly know if she had been a victim of her circumstances, or if she had simply made a decision to end it all. Courthouse was a frenzy of cameras, reporters, and people hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had shattered a family and a community. Jennifer Moore sat quietly at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor in front of her. The moment she entered the courtroom, there was no gasp of surprise, no outburst from the crowd. No one shouted. No one rushed to her defense. There was only the steady murmur of whispers, a low buzz of disbelief as the trial began. Jennifer had never been one to stand out, not in life, not even in a courtroom. The public had expected someone emotional, someone who would cry out in anguish, or beg for forgiveness, but Jennifer was none of those things. She was calm, too calm. It was as though everything had already been settled in her mind long before the trial began. The calmness in her eyes, the lack of visible remorse, only seemed to confuse and anger people even more. It was unsettling to watch. How could she sit there, so composed, after taking the lives of 8 children? How could she show no sign of regret? The trial itself unfolded slowly. Over the course of the first few days, witnesses came forward, teachers, neighbors, even family members. They all painted a picture of Jennifer as a hardworking, dedicated woman who had given everything for her husband and children. Some described her as a loving stepmother, doing her best to make a home for her blended family. Others painted a different picture. They spoke of her exhaustion, her withdrawal, her emotional and physical breakdown. They talked about the frustration they'd seen in her eyes, the way she seemed to retreat further into herself as the months went by. Her neighbors, while sympathetic to her plight, mentioned the signs they missed. Mrs. Reynolds, a neighbor who had known Jennifer for years, spoke to the jury about the woman who used to garden in the afternoons. She loved tending to the roses, Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice trembling. But I hadn't seen her out there in months. Her eyes, they didn't look the same anymore. But then there were the others, the ones who couldn't ignore the fact that Jennifer had ended the lives of 8 innocent children. She was selfish, one of her distant cousins testified. She wasn't the victim here. My aunt was a good mother. She raised her kids. Jennifer didn't want to raise anyone. She never asked for help, but she could have. She could have said something. She didn't. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, piece by piece. They painted Jennifer as a woman who had snapped under the pressure, yes, but who had also been hiding her frustrations for far too long. The children's deaths, they argued, were not some random outburst of rage, but the result of a carefully executed plan. Jennifer had acted with chilling precision. There was no panic, no wildness in her actions. She had waited for the right moment, when the house was quiet, when Richard was gone, when the children were all settled in their beds. They described the scene when the police arrived, the silence that met them, the way Jennifer sat calmly in the living room, as if nothing had happened. The crime scene was presented as meticulously organized, with no sign of violence or struggle. The children, they explained, had been tucked into their beds, just as Jennifer had planned. The method of execution was simple but devastating, and it became clear to everyone in the room that Jennifer had carefully considered her actions. Throughout the trial, Jennifer's detachment was evident. She never cried. She never looked at the victims' families, never apologized to them. Her eyes stayed on the floor, her posture stiff but not broken. There were moments during the testimonies when Jennifer's lips would twitch slightly, but she would quickly quell the impulse to react. It was as if she was already preparing herself for what would come next, just another step in a life that had worn her down, beyond recognition. But it wasn't just her composure that unsettled people. It was the absence of guilt. It was as if she had no emotional attachment to the crime, no remorse for what she had done. The prosecution, in closing arguments, referred to this as the most chilling aspect of the case. There is no question that Jennifer Moore was under immense pressure, they said. But the complete lack of remorse, the absence of any emotional response, this speaks volumes. She was not acting in a moment of panic. She was acting with cold, calculated precision. On the other side, the defense team worked tirelessly to show Jennifer's humanity. They presented evidence of the years of stress she had endured, the way she had been pushed to the brink of exhaustion, both emotionally and physically. They called in expert witnesses, psychologists and social workers, who testified that Jennifer had suffered from what was known as caregiver burnout, a condition that could cause a person to lose touch with reality and make irrational decisions in response to overwhelming stress. But even in their defense, there was something unsettling about Jennifer's demeanor. She wasn't pleading for sympathy. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She simply seemed to be accepting what had happened, as though it was the natural conclusion to a life that had spiraled out of control. The emotional depth that the defense tried to evoke was muted by Jennifer's own blankness. The jury was left to question, was she truly a victim of circumstance, or had she simply chosen to end it all because she couldn't take it anymore? As the trial progressed, the media coverage intensified. News stations ran stories day and night, analyzing every word Jennifer spoke, every gesture she made. The trial was broadcast live, with commentators arguing over whether Jennifer was a victim or a villain. The public seemed torn. Some sympathized with her, understanding the weight she had carried for so long, while others couldn't bring themselves to excuse her actions. "I think she's a victim of the system," one commentator said during a live interview. She was given these children with no support, and the pressure of raising 8 kids broke her. "We need to look at the bigger picture here. The lack of support from others like her, people like Jennifer, who are just expected to handle everything. I mean, we expect so much from parents. but others weren't as sympathetic. She killed 8 kids, another expert said. She had no excuse. She wasn't mentally ill. She wasn't a victim. She was a woman who couldn't handle the responsibility and chose to end it all. It's that simple. You don't get to take the lives of innocent children and then hide behind an excuse. The debates raged on, with some people calling for the harshest possible punishment, while others demanded that the court take Jennifer's mental state into account. The public's opinion was divided, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy over the case. No one could deny the tragedy, but the question of who was responsible and how much blame Jennifer should bear was far from clear. By the time the closing arguments were made, the courtroom was tense. The jury, who had sat silently through days of testimony, now seemed to carry the weight of the decision they had to make. Jennifer sat in her chair, unmoved, her hands still folded in her lap. She had said nothing since the trial had started, and now, as the final moments ticked away, she showed no sign of regret. The prosecutor's voice was sharp as he summarized the case. "We've heard from witnesses, from experts, and from those closest to the defendant, and we can see that this was no accident. This was no momentary lapse in judgment. Jennifer Moore made a choice, and that choice led to the deaths of 8 innocent children." The defense made their final plea, emphasizing Jennifer's mental state and the years of emotional and physical strain she had endured. They asked the jury to consider the circumstances in which Jennifer had lived, the overwhelming responsibility placed upon her, and the fact that she had never asked for help, but the damage had been done. Jennifer Moore, the stepmother who had once dreamed of a peaceful life, was now a woman who had ended the lives of 8 children. The jury filed out, and the world waited for the verdict. The courtroom was quieter than it had been throughout the entire trial. The air seemed to thicken with every passing second as Jennifer Moore sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded in front of her, her face a mask of stillness. The finality of the moment loomed over her, but she remained detached. She hadn't flinched when the verdict had been read, and she didn't stir as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. It was as though the years of emotional turmoil, the years of silent suffering, had led to this moment one, where even the weight of the children's deaths couldn't reach her. Jennifer wasn't broken. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't even looking for redemption. She sat motionless, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. She had already made peace with her actions, whether anyone else understood them or not. She knew what she had done. The court knew what she had done. And now it was time for the consequences. The judge's voice echoed in the courtroom, steady and unyielding. "Jennifer Moore, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, for the murders of your 8 stepchildren." The words were final. The sentence was heavy, but Jennifer's expression didn't change. There was no relief in her face, no regret, no anger, just a calm acceptance. As though in her mind, the world had already closed this chapter. She had made her choice. She had lived through the pain, and now she would serve the sentence for what she had done. But she didn't seem to feel the weight of it, not in the way the others did. Her family members, sitting in the crowded courtroom, exchanged tense glances. There was no unified response. Some of them looked away, their faces unreadable, while others wiped away tears. It was clear that this was not a simple case of justice served. The air was thick with complexity, with conflicting emotions that no one seemed able to process all at once. Her husband, Richard, sat at the back of the room, his face pale, his eyes distant. He hadn't spoken much throughout the trial, but his presence was palpable. The guilt, the confusion, the anger, he carried them all, but in silence. He had loved Jennifer. He had been blind to the growing toll it had taken on her, on their family. And now it felt as if everything he had known had been ripped apart in an instant. His children, his flesh and blood, were gone, and the woman he had loved, the woman who had promised to care for them, was now a convicted murderer. Richard didn't cry. He didn't scream or lash out. He just sat there, as the life he had known, the family he had built, crumbled around him. He hadn't been able to save them, and he hadn't been able to save her. Then there was Tasha, Jennifer's estranged daughter. She stood near the front, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her body trembling. The courtroom had been full of her anger and confusion ever since she had been forced to confront the truth. The woman who had raised her children, the woman who had stepped in when Tasha herself had failed to show up, this woman had killed her grandchildren. The weight of that realization seemed to buckle Tasha's knees. She felt a deep ache in her chest, as if something inside her had shattered. She had long been estranged from her mother, but this was something else entirely. Some family members had arrived, a few cousins, uncles, and distant relatives, but there was no unified front. Jennifer's actions had torn them all apart. They had lost the children, yes, but they had also lost their connection to Jennifer. Some saw her as a monster, a woman who had taken the lives of innocent children, and they demanded justice. Others tried to find understanding, to see her as a victim of an unrelenting burden. But the complexity of the situation didn't make it any easier to bear. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and yet Jennifer didn't seem to feel it. Her detachment was the most unsettling part of all. She was not broken by the trial. She didn't seem to care whether the world saw her as a villain or a victim. To her, it was all irrelevant. The act had already been done, and the sentence had already been passed. The sentencing continued with formalities, the usual recitation of the charges, the declaration of guilt, the explanations about parole and eligibility, all the words that would mark the end of Jennifer Moore's life as she had known it. But none of it seemed to penetrate her calm exterior. It was as if she had already left the room, already withdrawn into a place where the consequences of her actions didn't weigh her down. Her lawyers had tried to appeal for leniency, speaking of her emotional distress and years of caregiving, but Jennifer didn't seem to care about any of that. They asked if she wanted to speak, to offer her final words. Jennifer simply nodded. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost distant, as if she was speaking from another world. "I raised them longer than their mother ever did," she said, her words cutting through the room like a sharp knife. The words hung in the air, bitter and true, and there was no one in the room who could answer them. The judge gave a long pause. Jennifer had spoken without emotion, without apology, without regret. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, nor was it an admission of guilt. It was just a statement of fact. The courtroom was filled with silence, the weight of her words crashing into the room like a storm. Some in the room stood up in anger, unable to control their emotions. Others, like Tasha, sat frozen, unable to respond. For a long moment, no one moved. Jennifer was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, her expression unchanged, her body stiff as she walked down the aisle. She didn't glance back at her family or the people in the courtroom. Her eyes were focused straight ahead, and she moved with a quiet resignation, as though she had already made her peace with the world, as though the trial was just another moment in a long and weary journey. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting for her. Reporters swarmed the front steps, shouting questions, their cameras clicking incessantly. The public, still divided in their opinions, gathered in a mob outside, some shouting for justice, others calling for mercy. But Jennifer, in her mind, was far removed from it all. She had already left the room, already closed herself off from the chaos. As the media frenzy continued to unfold, family members drifted away, their emotions still raw, their opinions still conflicted. The public discourse began to settle into the usual dichotomy. Is she a monster? Or is she a woman broken by years of hardship? Some saw Jennifer as a victim of the system, a mother who had been pushed too far. Others couldn't reconcile the act of murder with the woman who had, at one point, cared for those children. The discussion was loud, but in Jennifer's mind, it was already over. The silence had already consumed her, and now it would never leave. Days later, as Jennifer was taken to prison, the community began to pick up the pieces of its fractured existence. The children were gone, and nothing could bring them back. The family members who had once been close were now scattered, their connections severed by the weight of Jennifer's actions. Some moved away, trying to distance themselves from the tragedy. Others stayed, but the grief was palpable, a heavy fog that hung over the neighborhood like an unwelcome guest. Jennifer Moore Once a woman who had given everything for her family, was now a prisoner of her own making. Her name would be remembered, but not with the love and respect she had once hoped for. Instead, it would be a name associated with tragedy, with failure, with a family torn apart. The final shot of the story, as the camera pulled away from the courthouse, captured the emptiness of the moment. Jennifer's presence still lingered in the minds of those who had known her. Her actions would never be forgotten, but the world would move on. The house, once filled with noise and chaos, was silent now. The echoes of her actions would reverberate through the community for years to come. But in the end, Jennifer Moore had already retreated into herself. The consequences were inescapable, but for Jennifer, the trial, the conviction, the punishment, was all just part of the inevitable ending she had already made peace with.